Do you need a friend to walk with you as you travel on your way? Then you need to know my Savior. Let him be your friend today.
Good morning. I'm V. Vernon Eckleberry, and I have a message for you entitled The Beginning, Episode 2. Some time ago, we had a lesson called The Beginning, Episode 1, and this is a follow-up to that. It's taken from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Let's look first of all at the most important words. The Bible is the most important book in all the world. Genesis is the most important book in the Bible. And chapter 1 is the most important chapter in Genesis. And verse 1 is the most important verse in the chapter. In the beginning, God are the most important words in that verse. Secondly, let's look at why in the beginning God are the most important words in the first chapter of Genesis. On this, in the beginning God, hangs the explanation for everything that follows. And on this phrase hangs the dividing point between faith and unbelief. As Paul wrote in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Also on this phrase, in the beginning God, hangs all the doctrine in the Bible. Every doctrine, if it is to be correctly taught and understood, must begin with in the beginning, God, as the beginner of all things. And on this phrase hangs the measure of all true sciences, philosophies, religions, and political systems. Only are they truly valid if they begin with God. Thirdly, let's look at the application of these things. You say, in the beginning God. God's the beginner of all things, including creation. But what do I do with that? What does that mean to me in my life? The practical application of it all. Well, we can jump ahead 4,000 years and get an idea of that. There was a gathering of philosophers hearing from a Roman born a Jew and also converted to Christianity. As Paul the apostle had strolled through Athens, he was looking at all the statues of the gods and their altars. He noticed that one altar represented the one thing that all the great minds had not been able to settle. Men like Socrates and Plato, Aristotle, and all of these great philosophers and scientists, they couldn't find the answer to where it all began. So Paul begins as he gives his presentation there among these philosophers who were gathered. He begins by filling this great gap. Where did it all begin? This is where Paul begins. Acts chapter 17, verse 22. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For, as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. And then Paul does just that. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. So there's the gap filled. To the unknown God, that Paul declares is the one who in the beginning created all things. Paul ends with the truth that this should bring us to. For 4,000 years, the world had only symbols pointing to the salvation of God. As such, God was patient with man during that time. As we read in verse 30, and the times of this ignorance God winked at, or he was patient with people because they didn't have the real thing. And so, with the advent of Christ, humankind must turn from their superstitions to Christ, to the one who is the beginning of all things. And of Christ we read in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, for by him were all things created, that is Jesus, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. So there it is. Jesus, the Son of God, is the Word that called all things that began in Genesis 1 into being. And it is him with whom we all have to do. And it is to him that the great knowledge of God's beginning creation in Genesis 1:1, it is to Jesus that all of this should point us. Knowing and believing in the beginning God means nothing if it does not point you to Christ, by whom all things are created. May he be the beginning of all things in your life is my prayer. Now, may God be with you till we meet again.
Do you